It began with a humiliation so swift and cutting that Lady Eleanor Hargrave would remember its sting long after the snow of that winter had melted into the quiet rivers of England. The carriage had barely halted before Buckingham Palace when a footman, believing she was still inside, muttered to a companion, "A pity the beautiful sister could not attend. This one looks as though she might vanish against the drapery." Eleanor heard every word. She stepped down anyway, spine straight, heart trembling, determined not to let a stranger's judgment undo the courage it had taken simply to arrive. Yet even before crossing the threshold, she felt the night tightening around her like an unwelcome corset. Inside, the palace hummed with the rustle of silk, clipped laughter, and the glitter of 100 chandeliers that cast brilliance upon those already certain of their place in society. Eleanor paused at the edge of the ballroom, her gloved hands clasped tightly in front of her, as though hiding the trembling beneath the fabric. She had come in her sister Rosalind's stead, an arrangement forced by circumstance and illness. Rosalind, beloved by all, admired for beauty so effortless it seemed heaven-sent, had pressed a kiss to Eleanor's forehead that afternoon and whispered, "You need not outshine them, Ellie. Simply be kind." But kindness, Eleanor feared, had little power within these gilded walls. The moment she entered fully, a pair of young ladies turned toward her with predatory grace, their fans lifting as though to shield their faces from an unpleasant draught. "Is that her?" one murmured. "Rosalind's sister?" The other's laugh was soft but merciless. "Poor creature. They should have postponed the ball." Their words slipped through Eleanor like needles, dulling her breath. She forced her gaze to the far windows, where dim winter light still clung to the sky, as though offering her an escape she could not take. Her gown, pale blue, modest, chosen because Rosalind said it suited her gentle nature, seemed almost childlike beside the opulence surrounding her, emerald velvets, crimson satins, gold embroidery so elaborate it caught every spark of candlelight. She knew she was not striking. She knew she did not possess the kind of beauty that caused rooms to still. Yet she had hoped, naively, that such truths might matter less tonight. She made her way toward a quieter corner, hoping invisibility could be a shield, but even there, judgment found her. An earl's son, flushed with wine and self-importance, approached as though intending to request a dance. His gaze flicked to her face, then away again, as though the sight offended him. "My apologies," he said lightly, "I mistook you for someone else." Eleanor managed a nod, though her throat tightened. She watched him retreat toward a group of glittering debutantes who welcomed him with bright laughter, their beauty embellished by confidence she had never been taught to wield. She clutched the small book Rosalind had tucked into her hand before she left, an old volume of poetry, its spine cracked with affection, and wondered if bringing it had been foolish. Books were her refuge, yet here they marked her as peculiar. Still, she held it close, the only thing in this room that felt like home. She did not notice the Duke of Ashford enter. She did not see how his tall frame drew glances, nor how his war-polished dignity made him seem a man carved from something steadfast. But he noticed her. From across the ballroom, amid the whirl of dancers and the rustle of gowns, his gaze settled upon the solitary young woman whose sorrow clung to her like frost. While others admired only beauty, the Duke observed something far rarer, a quiet strength in the way she tried to stand tall despite the cruelty encircling her. He approached a group of nobles but scarcely heard their greetings. A scar ran lightly along his temple, a reminder of battles fought far from England, where the air carried the scent of iron and fire. He had endured judgment for it, mocking whispers, intrusive stares, but the wound had taught him how pain reshapes a soul. Perhaps that was why he noticed Eleanor's discomfort so swiftly. He recognized the posture of someone accustomed to shrinking in order to survive. Eleanor, unaware of his attention, attempted a polite smile at a passing acquaintance, who ignored her entirely. Her cheeks warmed with shame. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, reminding her trembling heart that she belonged here by invitation, no matter how unworthy others deemed her. Yet the weight of comparison pressed heavily. All evening she had heard variations of the same sentiment. She was not Rosalind. She was a consolation prize. A shadow. She whispered to herself, "You must endure this," though her voice barely rose above the music. But endurance has its limits, and hers wavered when two older women stepped near, discussing the assemblage of ladies as though inspecting livestock. Rosalind Hargrave would have dazzled, one said. A pity her sister lacks, well, everything. The other sighed. Some girls are simply not made for court life. Eleanor felt the blow as keenly as if struck. Her fingers curled around her book until her knuckles paled. She turned toward the doorway, ready to slip out quietly, her dignity unraveling with each step. Had she been less heartbroken, she might have noticed that the Duke had shifted from his companions, his attention sharpening with every movement she made. It was as though he sensed her retreat before she fully committed to it. Near the exit, Eleanor paused. The cold air from the corridor touched her skin, offering a whisper of relief. Leaving meant surrender, yet staying felt unbearable. She closed her eyes for a moment, wishing fervently that she were anywhere but here. When she opened them, she found someone standing several paces away, watching her with an expression she did not recognize, calm, observant, almost gentle. The Duke of Ashford. She had heard his name spoken with awe earlier, but she had not expected to meet his gaze, let alone find something like compassion within it. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Eleanor felt the unspoken question in his eyes, will you let them drive you from a room where you rightfully belong? She did not know his story, nor he hers, yet something about his steady presence pierced the loneliness surrounding her. Then a voice behind them, sharp, amused, cut the moment in two. The Duke is watching the plain sister, someone whispered. How curious. The words struck like a final blow. Eleanor lowered her gaze, breath-catching, torn between shame and the strange, fragile comfort of that brief connection. Without another glance, she stepped toward the shadows of the corridor. Behind her, the Duke's jaw tightened, not in judgment of her, but in recognition of the cruelty inflicted upon her. And as she disappeared from the ballroom, he took one decisive step forward, as though he had made up his mind to follow. News of Eleanor Hargrave's supposed impropriety raced through the palace corridors with the merciless speed of wildfire. By dawn, whispers claimed she had intentionally lured the Duke of Ashford into a private moment, though she had done nothing more than flee humiliation. Servants exchanged knowing glances, courtiers sharpened their suspicions, and by the time Eleanor stepped into the garden salon for morning tea, she felt as though the entire court had already weighed and condemned her. Each murmur pressed against her ribs like an invisible hand, reminding her she had entered a world eager to feast on weakness that day. She took her place among the assembled ladies, praying her trembling hands remained hidden beneath the tablecloth. A footman approached with a silver tray, carrying a folded parchment sealed with the Ashford crest. The room fell into a charged stillness as heads turned, hungry for scandal. Eleanor hesitated, fearing the message might accuse her of impropriety, yet she accepted it with quiet dignity. Inside lay a pressed winter rose and a line in the Duke's firm hand, for the lady who looked lonelier than she deserved. The note struck her like unexpected kindness, fragile yet powerful enough to steady her that day. Gasps fluttered across the table as shameless curiosity bloomed. One lady leaned toward another, whispering loudly enough for half the salon to hear, questioning whether the Duke pitied Eleanor or whether she had ensnared him with calculated meekness. Eleanor's throat tightened. She could not return the rose publicly without seeming ungrateful, nor keep it without feeding the fire. When tea concluded, she slipped the flower into an envelope and asked a passing footman to return it discreetly. Her heart ached with the hope she dared not admit, that his gesture had felt sincere, untouched by pity or performance that morning. The Duke received the returned rose shortly before midday, and those present swore the faint softening of his expression hinted at both amusement and concern. Rather than abandon the matter, he requested his horse and rode to the palace gardens where the ladies often strolled. Eleanor, unaware of his approach, walked alone beneath the leafless arches, her steps small, careful, heavy with uncertainty. She paused near a stone bench to collect herself when a shadow fell across the path. She turned, and found the Duke himself standing before her, holding the very rose she had hoped to vanish from sight today. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "I believe this belongs to you." Heat rose to her cheeks as she shook her head. She explained that she had not wished to invite further gossip. The Duke's gaze softened, carrying the steadiness of a man who had weathered storms harsher than social whispers. He assured her the gesture had been offered without expectation, merely a recognition of solitude he had once known himself. Eleanor, moved yet frightened by the scrutiny around them, begged him to keep the rose private, for her sake that quiet morning. Their conversation might have ended gently had three court ladies not rounded the corner at that precise moment. Their eyes widened at the sight, Eleanor standing close to the Duke, the rose glimmering faintly between them. The women exchanged triumphant looks, already crafting the scandal they would deliver to the palace by supper. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She stepped back quickly, nearly knocking over a potted urn. The Duke, seeing her distress, attempted to speak, but the ladies dipped shallow curtsies and hurried away, leaving a cloud of poisonous speculation in their wake that morning air. Eleanor's composure shattered the moment they vanished from view. She apologized to the Duke for drawing him into trouble, though he insisted the fault was not hers. Still, fear coiled inside her. She imagined the gossip spreading like ink across parchment, distorting, staining, erasing truth. She knew how quickly court opinion could harden. Rosalind had once said a woman's reputation at court was more delicate than crystal. Eleanor felt hers already cracking. The Duke studied her with a quiet intensity, as though searching for the words that would keep her from slipping further into despair on that cold, uncertain morning today. "He will not let them ruin you," a part of her hoped, though she dared not voice it. The Duke, after a long contemplative pause, offered her the rose once more. She refused again, softer this time, pleading for discretion. He nodded, though reluctance flickered in his eyes. Before either could speak further, another approaching figure forced them apart, a royal advisor with a hawk's stare who noted every detail of the scene. Eleanor bowed quickly, retreating before her presence could draw further suspicion. The Duke remained still, jaw tense, as though bracing for a storm in the troubled court today. Eleanor hurried back toward the palace, heart pounding against her ribs as though trying to escape. She felt exposed, cornered, fragile under the weight of rumor. Every passing servant seemed to stare too long, every echo of footsteps felt like pursuit. She tried to remind herself she had done nothing wrong, yet shame clung to her like damp wool. By the time she reached the east corridor, she could barely breathe. She leaned against a pillar, fighting tears, wishing desperately for Rosalind's calming voice or her father's steady reassurance, anything to anchor her in this treacherous world of cold whispers today. The Duke, meanwhile, remained in the garden long after she departed. He replayed every moment, the tremor in her voice, the urgency of her retreat, the cruel delight in the lady's eyes, and felt the old battle-honed anger stirring within him. He had seen injustice faced on fields far from England, yet this quiet cruelty unsettled him more sharply. He returned to the palace with a resolve he could not fully name. Whatever storm gathered around Eleanor, he would not stand idle. And when he stepped into the corridor, he caught sight of her turning a corner, unaware he followed her now. He quickened his pace, sensing fate tightening grip around them. The storm of rumor and whispered judgment reached Eleanor with the cruel immediacy of a winter gale, striking harder than the frost that clung to the palace windows. She fled the crowded corridors, ignoring the prying eyes and the faint, shocked gasps of servants, until she found herself upon the west terrace, where the chill of early morning bit through her shawl and stripped away pretense. She leaned against the cold stone balustrade, hands pressed to her chest, as though she could hold her fragile courage there. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps, and for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to cry, not in the hidden privacy of her bedchamber, but openly, defiantly, letting shame mingle with the cold air, each sob a small act of rebellion against the court that sought to diminish her. She thought of Rosalind, of her elder sister's effortless grace and brilliant beauty, and a wave of despair rolled through her. Why had she been sent in her place? Why had she, Eleanor, been chosen to bear the weight of society's scrutiny while Rosalind rested in bed, free from the necessity of performance? Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her face, trying to stave off the tears, yet they would not be denied. She whispered to the frozen garden, to the empty air, the truth she had long kept buried: I am nothing. I am invisible. I am not beautiful. The sound of footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, measured. Eleanor did not turn at first, too wrapped in her own misery, too convinced that any presence near her would only confirm the harsh verdict of the world. And yet, there was a difference in these steps, not the hurried, judgmental footfalls of court attendants, not the clumsy pursuit of gossips. These were steps that carried weight, certainty, and a silent respect for the one they approached. She turned, startled, and found the Duke of Ashford standing a few paces away, his gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter and her pulse quicken. He did not speak immediately, merely observed, and in that quiet scrutiny, Eleanor felt a strange sensation she had never known, seen, understood, and not condemned. You should not stand here alone, he said at last, his voice low, calm, and strangely warm. There was no rebuke in it, no hidden admonition, only the recognition of her distress. Eleanor swallowed hard, her lips trembling. I should not be here at all, she admitted, her voice a mere breath against the wind. I have no claim to this place. I am less than my sister, less than anyone. The Duke stepped closer, his coat brushing the terrace stones with a soft swish. And yet, you are here, he replied, and you endure the judgment of 1,000 eyes with dignity few could muster. That is worth far more than fleeting beauty. Eleanor's heart constricted at the words, and she lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by the rarity of such unvarnished acknowledgment. She had lived her life in shadows, under the long and constant light cast by Rosalind, yet here was a man who saw her not as a consolation, not as a shadow, but as a being of substance and worth. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I am not pretty, she whispered, almost ashamed of her own confession, as though the very act of admitting it made her flawed beyond redemption. The wind stirred, tossing her hair against her pale cheeks, carrying the faint scent of frost and iron from the distant gardens. The Duke's expression softened further, and he took another step closer, closing the distance with deliberate care. To me, he said, his voice trembling with a quiet certainty that startled her, you are the most beautiful of all, my love. The words fell like sunlight through the clouds of a long, oppressive storm. Eleanor could not speak, could only stare at him, her pulse hammering against her chest as though trying to escape the fragile prison of her ribcage. She had never heard such sincerity, never felt such deliberate gentleness in her entire life. All the laughter, all the whispers, all the sneers that had haunted her since childhood seemed to pale before the weight of a single declaration, uttered with no expectation, no demand, only truth. "You," she began, but her voice failed, caught somewhere between hope and disbelief. She looked away, toward the frozen gardens below, as though seeing the snow-laden branches might ground her in reality. "I am unworthy," she managed at last, her words trembling like fragile glass. "I am not meant to be," she could not finish, for even in her own ears the thought sounded impossible. The Duke reached for her hand, a gesture at once tender and grounding, his fingers brushing hers lightly against the cold stone. "Unworthy is a word invented by those who fear what they do not understand," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "You are not defined by their eyes, Lady Eleanor. You are defined by courage, by compassion, and by the quiet light that refuses to be extinguished even under the weight of their scrutiny." She lifted her gaze then, meeting his eyes fully for the first time that morning, and felt the unspoken understanding between them settle like snow upon a branch. Here was a man who had walked through fire, who had borne scars and judgment alike, and yet he saw her not for what the world claimed she was, but for what she had always secretly known herself to be, resilient, kind, and unexpectedly worthy of love. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they stood there, the winter wind tugging at cloaks and shawls, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from distant chimneys. In that frozen garden, insulated from the court's endless scrutiny, Eleanor allowed herself to feel a rare emotion, hope. A hope so fragile she feared it might shatter if spoken aloud, yet so profound that it rooted itself in her heart with the tenacity of ivy-climbing stone. "I have been invisible," she admitted finally, her voice steadier now, strengthened by the Duke's unwavering attention. "I have been overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. And yet," her gaze faltered, searching for the right words, "and yet you see me." The Duke inclined his head slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. "I do," he said simply, with the weight of promise in his tone. "And I shall continue to do so, regardless of the whispers or the judgments that seek to follow you." A sudden movement at the edge of the terrace, an approaching shadow, reminded Eleanor that the world outside this intimate space was still watchful, still cruel. She tensed instinctively, her fingers tightening around the shawl draped over her shoulders. "They will not understand," she murmured. "The court, the advisors, they will never allow this, us, to exist without interference." He placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. "Let them speak. Let them judge. Their voices are but wind through the trees. You and I, here, now, are the only truth that matters." Eleanor drew in a shivering breath, the cold pressing against her skin, the intensity of his gaze holding her steady in a way no courtly approval ever had. She had survived ridicule, dismissal, and endless comparisons, yet never before had she felt truly seen. Her lips quivered as she tried to form a response, but no words seemed adequate. Only the flutter of her heart, erratic and tender, answered the unspoken question: could this fragile spark between them endure the storm that had already begun outside these terrace walls? The Duke's eyes never left hers, calm yet unwavering, as though silently vowing protection in a world that had offered none. In that moment, Eleanor felt a shift within herself, subtle yet undeniable, the first stirrings of courage born not from fear, but from the recognition that someone believed in her, truly believed in her, beyond appearances and expectation. The winter wind swirled around them, tossing her hair and chilling her hands, yet she did not retreat. A faint echo of a voice, an official from the palace corridors, reached Eleanor's ears, distant but unmistakable. Footsteps approaching, questions ready to be asked, the inevitable intrusion of reality pressing near. She knew, with a sharp, sudden clarity, that their moment of intimacy and honesty could not last unchallenged. And yet, for the first time, Eleanor did not shrink. She did not look away. She met the approaching intrusion with the quiet strength that had remained hidden all her life, now illuminated by the unexpected kindness of a man who had declared her the most beautiful of all. And as the shadow drew closer, the faintest trace of a smile touched her lips, a fragile, defiant hope that perhaps, for once, the world might not define her alone. The palace erupted into chaos before Eleanor could even reach the safety of her private chambers. Word of her morning encounter with the Duke of Ashford had spread like fire through dry underbrush, igniting a frenzy of judgment and speculation. Courtiers whispered, servants gossiped, and advisors scowled as though they alone had the power to dictate morality. Eleanor's name, once spoken only with polite admiration, now carried the sting of scandal, tainting every step she took through the gilded halls. She hurried forward, head lowered, hands clutching the folds of her gown as if it could shield her from the relentless eyes. Her heart pounded in her chest, heavy with fear, heavy with the certainty that she had no ally in a world poised to condemn her. The Duke, too, had sensed the rising storm. From his private study, he had observed the court's reaction through curtained windows, noting the pointed fingers and subtle smirks aimed at Eleanor's retreating figure. He had already witnessed the cruelty of judgment on foreign fields, yet the battlefield of the royal court proved a different, more insidious torment. Here, innocence mattered little, perception mattered everything. And he would not allow hers to be tarnished without standing firmly beside her, regardless of the cost. He resolved, in that quiet, resolute moment, that no whisper or insult could dictate his actions, nor sway his judgment of the woman who had captivated him with courage rather than beauty. By evening, the ballroom had been prepared for a formal gathering, its chandeliers aglow with countless candles reflecting against the polished floors. Eleanor hesitated at the doorway, hands trembling, anticipating the murmurs that would inevitably follow her entry. She moved with careful steps, forcing her gaze downward, aware that every eye would track her arrival. And indeed, the moment she appeared, conversation stilled for an instant, then resumed in a low hum of speculation. She could hear fragments. "It is said the Duke favors her, she is daring to appear despite the scandal." Each word struck her like ice, yet she pressed onward, a quiet defiance building with each measured step. The Duke's entrance, meanwhile, was deliberate and commanding. He did not glance at the courtiers, nor allow their murmurs to disturb him. His eyes sought only one presence in the room, and when they found Eleanor, a subtle tension eased within him. He advanced to the center of the ballroom, his bearing unwavering, and halted near her with a poise that demanded attention. Conversations faltered. Noblemen and women alike could not help but notice the quiet authority with which he claimed the space. For a fleeting moment, the gossiping voices were silenced by the force of his conviction alone. He had come not to intimidate, nor to conquer, but to protect, yet in the eyes of the court, even protective gestures became fodder for scandal. Eleanor's breath caught as he extended his hand, the gesture simple yet laden with significance. She hesitated, torn between fear of public censure and the inexplicable trust she had begun to place in him. The murmur swelled once more, yet Eleanor felt the grip of his gaze, steady and unwavering, grounding her in a way that defied the court's scrutiny. The faintest tremor of courage stirred within her chest. This was no longer a moment defined by shame, but by the fragile assertion of dignity, of belonging, however tentative it might feel. "I shall not have my heart dictated by whispers," the Duke announced, his voice carrying across the hall with deliberate clarity. Heads turned sharply, some gasped, others murmured with disbelief. Eleanor, unsure whether to flee or stay, froze in place, her pulse racing. The statement alone had altered the energy of the room. It was not a demand of obedience, nor a threat, it was an unyielding declaration that her worth, her presence, and her right to exist unjudged in this world were his concern now. The subtle courage that had begun to bloom within Eleanor's heart ignited fully at those words, a warmth against the chill of countless critiques. He offered her his hand again, this time publicly, as a symbol that her dignity was not negotiable. Courtiers exchanged stunned glances. Some considered it a breach of protocol, others a defiance of decorum, yet Eleanor felt the weight of it not as spectacle, but as promise. She allowed her fingers to brush against his, and in that fleeting contact, a tremor of hope surged through her. She felt recognized, truly seen, in a way that no amount of whispered gossip or derisive glance could diminish. The ballroom, once oppressive, became a stage for courage rather than condemnation. As they moved toward the center of the room, their steps measured, the world around them seemed to slow. Eleanor could hear the soft rustle of her gown, the faint creak of polished floorboards beneath their feet, yet her attention was consumed entirely by the Duke's presence. He led her with ease, neither flaunting authority nor courting admiration, simply asserting her right to occupy the space she had always feared. Each movement was a declaration that they would not be bound by expectation, that love, when rooted in sincerity, could challenge even the strictest societal constraints. But the court's response was not silent. A collective murmur rippled through the assembly, punctuated by sharp glances and suppressed gasps. A royal advisor, eyes narrowed, approached the edge of the dance floor, his disapproval barely contained. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, the fragile thread of hope fraying as judgment once again threatened to suffocate her. Yet the Duke did not falter. His hand on hers tightened ever so slightly, a silent affirmation that her worth was not for others to decide. In that touch lay courage, resolve, and a quiet rebellion against the tyranny of appearances. Their dance began, tentative at first, a waltz that carried the weight of unspoken truths and defiance. Eleanor's initial fear melted slowly, replaced by a sense of belonging she had never known. She moved with him, her body responding to his guidance, and for the first time, she felt a harmony that had nothing to do with her reflection in polished mirrors or the whispers of onlookers. It was a harmony of souls, fragile yet potent, unbroken by the scrutiny of the court. Each step, each turn, was a quiet assertion that the judgment of others could not dictate their hearts. The murmurs persisted, growing louder as they continued, but Eleanor no longer wavered. The Duke's calm, unwavering presence anchored her. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that the fear which had gripped her since childhood could not endure in the face of genuine recognition. She had survived countless moments of comparison, ridicule, and invisibility, yet here she moved boldly, acknowledged and cherished in the only way that truly mattered. The scandal outside these walls, the judgments of court and kin, could not touch the bond forming between them now. As the music swelled and the last echoes of their waltz lingered in the grand hall, Eleanor's eyes met the Duke's once more. In them, she saw promise, protection, and an unwavering conviction that their connection would not be silenced. Yet even in this triumph, a shadow lingered: the royal advisor's approach, the sharp scrutiny of those who deemed themselves arbiters of propriety, and the inevitable gossip that would follow every movement they made together. Eleanor sensed the fragile nature of their victory, aware that the battle for acceptance and understanding was only beginning. The Duke, noticing her apprehension, whispered softly, "Do not fear them. Our truth is ours alone." Eleanor drew a shivering breath, clinging to the weight of his words like a lifeline. She felt courage threading through her veins, fragile yet unyielding, as if the act of standing beside him had transformed fear into determination. And as she glanced toward the growing crowd of observers, she realized that whatever came next, she would face it not alone, but with someone who had chosen to see her for what she truly was. And yet, even as hope and resolve swelled within her, a subtle shift at the edge of the ballroom caught her eye, a figure stepping from the shadows, silent but deliberate, whose presence carried the promise of new challenges and complications, a reminder that the court's judgments were not easily defied. Eleanor's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the Duke's hand as the faintest tremor of uncertainty touched her heart. For the first time, she understood that courage alone might not suffice, and that love, however sincere, would demand sacrifice, wit, and resilience yet to be tested. The palace awoke to a tension so thick it pressed against walls and ceilings, leaving every servant and noble alike unsettled. News of the Duke's public favor toward Eleanor had reached the Queen's private chambers, and whispers slithered through gilded corridors with the urgency of a storm about to break. Courtiers exchanged nervous glances, some prepared to confront, others to witness with voyeuristic delight. Eleanor, aware of every eye upon her, felt the familiar tremor of fear begin to creep along her spine. Yet, this morning was different. Today she would not shrink, not retreat, not vanish into the shadows that had long defined her existence. Today, she would stand, and she would stand beside the man who had first dared to see her worth. The Duke of Ashford approached the ballroom with a measured stride, his presence commanding yet tempered by quiet vigilance. Every step echoed with authority, a promise of protection, and Eleanor, following behind, drew strength from it. She wore a gown of muted silver, elegant but unassuming, with threads that caught candlelight like morning frost. Her hair was pinned with care, soft tendrils framing a face that had never needed embellishment to convey sincerity. As she entered the hall, the murmurs rose, a tide of curiosity, envy, and disbelief, yet she moved forward with deliberate poise, shoulders squared against the world's scrutiny. The Duke's hand brushed hers, a subtle tether to courage that had been fragile only hours before. The Queen's gaze fell upon them, sharp and deliberate, measuring, weighing, questioning. Eleanor felt it like a physical touch, cool and judgmental, yet she did not falter. The Duke stepped beside her, offering a slight bow, not of submission, but of respect, and Eleanor's heart stirred with an unfamiliar clarity. Here was a man whose honor was not easily swayed, whose principles had been forged in fire, and who now extended that strength to her. The quiet daughter of a minor noble family overshadowed all her life. Their united presence, understated yet resolute, began to shift the atmosphere. Courtiers who had anticipated scandal found themselves unsettled by the undeniable dignity of the pair before them. A hush settled, broken only by the soft hum of chandeliers swaying from the palace drafts. The Duke inclined his head toward Eleanor, and she met his gaze, eyes wide but steady. "Fear them not," he whispered, voice low but potent enough to carry through the attentive silence. "We answer only to truth." Eleanor's breath caught. Those words were an anchor, steadying her trembling heart. She had spent her life measured against impossible standards of beauty, charm, and refinement, yet here, beside the Duke, she was measured only for her integrity, her courage, her quiet honesty. As if summoned by their shared resolve, the first courtiers stepped forward, questioning, probing, testing. A senior advisor, frowning, demanded to know why Eleanor had received such favor, suggesting impropriety or artifice. Eleanor held her head high, recalling the Duke's reassurance. She spoke with careful composure, each word deliberate. "I have done nothing to seek favor but have been treated with kindness. The Duke's generosity is no reflection of scandal but of honesty, and I am grateful for it." The words, though simple, carried authority born from sincerity. The room fell into a tentative stillness. Judgment had met an unexpected wall of fortitude, and even those who sought fodder for gossip paused, uncertain. The Duke placed a steady hand at the small of her back, guiding her to a center where light from the chandeliers cascaded like gentle snow. He spoke next, his tone deliberate, commanding respect without arrogance. "Lady Eleanor Hargrave demonstrates the virtues we often forget to value in public life: honesty, kindness, and the courage to stand despite the murmur of ridicule. Let it be known that these qualities are more prized than mere appearance or fleeting beauty." The statement rippled through the ballroom. Some whispered disbelief, others admiration, but none could deny the weight of his conviction. Eleanor felt a warmth rising in her chest, hope threading through every nerve, and for the first time, she sensed a possibility she had scarcely dared to imagine, that her life might not always be defined by comparison, but by the integrity of her own heart. The murmurs did not vanish entirely, yet their sting had dulled. Eleanor's fingers brushed the Duke's again, a subtle but deliberate signal that she trusted him, that she was ready to face whatever further scrutiny the world might cast upon them. He nodded once, a silent affirmation that their alliance was both mutual and unshakable. The court watched, tension palpable, as two people stood in quiet defiance of expectation, tethered not by strategy, flattery, or wealth, but by a shared acknowledgement of worth, courage, and sincere regard. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Eleanor found herself speaking freely for the first time that day. She recounted, calmly yet vividly, the morning's trials, the whispers in corridors, the dismissive glances, the loneliness she had endured. Her voice carried not just fear, but resilience, and each listener could sense the fragility transformed into strength. The Duke remained silent beside her, but his presence alone amplified every word, giving her courage she had never known she possessed. Together, they rendered the court powerless to shame her, demonstrating that sincerity, integrity, and courage could triumph even in the most superficial of arenas. By evening, the ballroom had transformed. The tension that had threatened to suffocate Eleanor was replaced by a quiet, charged admiration. She moved through the room with a newfound assurance, her steps deliberate, her gaze unflinching. The Duke remained at her side, vigilant but unobtrusive, an anchor and shield alike. Courtiers whispered less of scandal now, shifting instead to curiosity tinged with respect. Eleanor realized that the storm of judgment had not vanished entirely, but it no longer defined her. For the first time, she walked not as a shadow, but as a woman recognized for her strength, her kindness, and her unassuming grace. Finally, as the last notes of music drifted through the hall and candlelight flickered softly across polished floors, the Duke offered Eleanor his arm. She accepted without hesitation, feeling the gentle steadiness of his presence. "You are seen," he murmured, almost tenderly, "not for the beauty others demand, but for the beauty of your heart, which is far rarer." Eleanor's breath caught, words failed her, yet in the simple clasp of his hand and the warmth in his gaze, she understood fully the depth of his sincerity. She smiled, fragile yet radiant, as the first genuine hope of her life took root. The court watched in silence as they walked together toward the exit, their steps calm but deliberate. Each footfall was a quiet declaration that the judgments of others no longer dictated Eleanor's worth. The Duke's protective presence, combined with her newfound courage, created a harmony of strength and sincerity that rendered whispers impotent. Yet, even in this triumph, Eleanor could feel the faintest tremor of the world beyond the palace walls, subtle but insistent, a reminder that life, though capable of extraordinary kindness, would always require vigilance, integrity, and courage. As they paused beneath the grand archway leading to the palace gardens, Eleanor looked up at the Duke, her eyes shimmering with gratitude and a quiet, unspoken affection. I do not know how to thank you," she whispered. "You have made me feel visible, seen, more than I ever thought possible." He smiled, faint, resolute, and brushed a stray tendril of hair from her cheek. "No thanks are necessary," he said softly. "You have merely allowed yourself to exist with honesty and courage. That alone is a gift greater than any bestowed by palace or title. And I am honored to witness it." Eleanor's chest tightened as she realized the truth. She was no longer defined by shadows or whispers. She had endured ridicule, humiliation, and fear, and emerged not just intact, but recognized, cherished for the qualities that mattered most. And yet, even as she felt the swell of hope, she sensed the subtle pull of future trials, the weight of expectation, the persistence of gossip, and the ever-present demand of decorum. It was a delicate balance, but one she was now willing to face, knowing she would not do so alone. As the winter sun dipped behind the distant spires, casting the gardens in soft twilight, Eleanor and the Duke stood together, hand in hand, a quiet promise between them. They had faced judgment, endured scrutiny, and discovered courage within themselves that had long lain dormant. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, the bond they had forged promised resilience, warmth, and a shared conviction that honesty, integrity, and love, true love, could withstand even the most relentless storms. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor allowed herself a full, unguarded breath, savoring the fragile triumph and the beauty of being seen. And in that breath, she realized, this was only the beginning, and whatever awaited beyond the palace gates, they would face it together, steadfast and undaunted, hearts aligned against a world too often blind to the quiet splendor of character.